Welcome to the MBA series. This is a special multi-part series within Next Economy Now. We are going to review the arc of the learning journey that is presented in the Next Economy MBA online course. We are open sourcing the content from our course and hope to share it in this shorter, bite-sized format. We are launching this series because we were asked to do it by listeners like you. We're also doing it because we are writing a book entitled The Next Economy MBA, Redesigning Business for the Benefit of All Life, which will be published on May 23rd, 2023 by Barrett Kohler Publishers. This is a sizable series. There will eventually be 18 podcast episodes of course content and 9 interviews with MBA alumni. We will be rotating every other week with our normal Next Economy Now interview format. We hope you enjoy it. Please reach out to us via our website, lifteconomy.com, with any comments, feedback, or requests. And now, on with the show.
Hello, and welcome to the Next Economy Now podcast series, where we're going deep dive into our MBA components of the learning journey. My name is Erin Axelrod, and I'm a partner and a worker owner at Lift Economy.
And I'm Phoenix Soleil, and I am also a partner and worker owner at Lift Economy.
So, Phoenix, so grateful to share this time with you around a topic which I know is dear to both of us. We're kind of both in it, always. So, I think it would be helpful to give listeners a little bit of context. Some folks might be wondering, well, if you're teaching a course about entrepreneurship, why are you talking about personal life design? Do you want me to start, or you want
to? Go for it, Erin.
So it's interesting, right? Because there's so many implications that, Phoenix, you and I see when we coach and work with entrepreneurs or work with clients, how much the personal choices that folks make in their life actually have a meaningful implication around how we can structure collective needs in an ecosystem or an organization. And so while it's a component, it's not the entirety, it does make a difference. And that's what we grapple with in this session of the MBA, how our personal choices make a difference around economic implications for salaries within organizations, etc.
Yeah, and I think what happens is that you, through the MBA, and many of people, even before they got to the MBA, they realize the way we're living modern life is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the world, the nature, climate, and it's also not sustainable for individuals. I mean, a lot of us are overworked or feel unsatisfied in our lives. And one of the ways that we think about is that, how do you make your life sustainable? How do you make it rewarding on multiple levels? And when you realize that the path that you're offered, if you just look at the mainstream, once you realize it's not the healthiest, then it takes a lot of bravery and creativity to go off that beaten path and find those answers. And I think it's so important work because, I mean, there used to be this, there can be this idea, well, I'm just going to buckle down and work really hard and just like do what I can to save the world. And then you leave yourself out. And it's like, we don't think that's like long-term going to work. So I hope this will help people with that struggle. Hope this session.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more, Phoenix. And what you said reminded me that part of what we're hoping this session inspires in people is curiosity and creativity, because oftentimes what I notice about our students is there's some unquestioned beliefs around, for example, the normal pathway of paying for our needs is getting a job. But then when we really look at it, there's this whole plurality historically and contemporary cultures where people are meeting their needs via gift economy or barter or other forms of reciprocity. And those stories are really important kind of guideposts for folks who are curious about designing a life that really meets the whole spectrum of people with skills and gifts and visions of their life that doesn't necessarily fit into like a specific box or the normal pathway of this is how you need to craft your life.
Yeah, very true. And I think what happens is that when people start to want to be creative, they can get stuck because one of the things is that it requires interdependence because our world is actually full of, where our podcast is coming, we're both living in America. And so we have this myth of self-reliance and, I do it all on my own. But what happens is that we're actually we're sometimes as a culture blinded to how dependent we are because the roads, the buildings, the food we eat, we're more actually dependent than, let's say, a farmer who was growing their own food and had a horse for transport and didn't need roads and all that. But it's like we have the feeling of, and there is so much isolation even though, we have such a huge degree of dependence. But then part of it is the switch is that you start to how do I create a community? I feel like part of it is like, how do I create a community where I start to get needs in a different way, where those relationships are conscious and they're reciprocal? I think that's an element that's part of the struggle.
Hugely potent examples there, Phoenix. And we actually have kind of a graph that we show that, shows on the one extreme, the dependent consumer, and then the other extreme, the global producer, and just how isolated those two sort of archetypes have become in a economy that categorically and chronically exploits from producers and creates consumers that are highly, highly dependent. And we've moved so much of us living in the United States have moved so far away from being producers ourselves. And there's a risk in overcorrecting too much and just saying, hey, I'm going to produce all my own food and I'm going to produce all my own shelter and all my own clothing. And pretty soon you get like overwhelmed and exhausted and you've alienated all the people around you and you're comparing yourself to them. And so I loved what you said around like, life design is actually an opportunity for us to forge more connections, become more close to others with differing life experiences, and actually really see how we are interdependent. So we're going to share some tools for folks because these are frameworks we found to be helpful. And one of them is looking at and exploring our relationship to consumption. And it's a tool called the hierarchy of consumption. And whereas much of the training talks about, how do we create businesses and organizations to change the way we produce goods, services, the way we deliver needs in a world that right now is characterized by a lot of exploitation, how do we do it in ways that are more life-affirming? Most of the training is going to talk about that, but there is this component of consumption. And so this hierarchy of consumption, Phoenix, I'm curious if you want to share a little bit about what this has meant for you personally, this thinking about your consumption and kind of questioning and learning how to navigate through these questions around our own personal consumption.
Right. Well, I've been trying to downsize my life so that I can fit my life into a smaller system, a structure. And it's like you have to confront some of your own personal attachments to, I think stuff is one of the places where it shows up at things where I have two of something and I don't need two right now. But because there's this feeling, oh, I don't know what's going to happen, I want to just hold on to those two things. And a scarcity thinking, and it's how do you? And so I look through, and then sometimes it's about this thing was really expensive, even though I don't need it. I have a value. I value the fact that other people would value it, and then it's like, well, how do I step into and letting it go. And how do I decide that? How do I start to have that confidence? And the thing is that this is not just a personal thing, because it's that kind of like holding on to things that when it's multiplied by millions of people has an incredible impact on society. Like, you think, I don't have a land. For example, there was a time in my life where I needed to use a chainsaw because we were doing some kind of work with some building something. And I was like, it was like one of those things where I was so excited when I lived in Berkeley, where they have a tool library. And there you go. I mean, this thing that I bought, and I got the cheapest one I could, and I still remember it. It was neon green. And it was just in my space for like 7 years, until finally when I moved away, I was like, I think I need to let go of this, really small chainsaw. And it's just like, how do we create those bonds with people so that we can trade? Like, I was just talking to a friend about, she lives in a space where her family already has a car, and she's thinking about buying another car because there's times she needs to use it and her partner is away. And I was talking about her about car sharing, and she's like, I have a neighbor who has 3 cars, and it never ever occurred to me that there could be some system where that car that's not getting used much I could use it. And when you do that, it's also good for the car. But so there's all these examples of a different way of being. But then I feel like some of the challenges to that is having healthy bonds with other people. Like, how do you write contracts? How do you deal with the risk? And it's intimacy with people. It's intimacy, and it's trying to create safety in a new way where it's not all about, I do it on my own. And how do we share those situations with people? And yeah. I know that you do some of this. Tell me about your experience.
Absolutely. I mean, you brought up so many places where we could go deeper. And you talked about the implication as one person, but then in the US, the Census Bureau has estimated that we spend $6 billion annually constructing self-storage facilities. So the implications of everyone having their own item, it's actually creating these scarcity of space in our world that people are then having to pay for more self-storage. And so there are very real implications. But the point that you made around the barriers or obstacles that are keeping us from kind of solution creations around how do we share goods, or how do we do car shares, electric car shares, because, we can use our e-bikes for the time that we're not needing a full vehicle to get a long distance. Yeah, it's so potent. I really appreciated you sharing that around the kind of human systems and barriers that stop us from, being more sharing, being more resourceful. Thanks for bringing that up. And so, with the hierarchy of consumption, we have this kind of set of questions that are kind of helpful, but there's a lot of different resources. These questions are things like questioning, do I really need it when we're making a consumption purchase decision? We actually have that question twice because we have to counter personally this huge movement that is trying to make us believe that we need to consume a lot of goods in order to be fulfilled or happy or joyful. And that's intentionally designed.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of money that is spent to make you believe that you need something, that you need to buy a product, and people are being paid thousands and thousands of dollars to be successful at getting you to believe it.
And then we get into other creativity, like, can I borrow it? Can I make it? Can I get it used? Do you have any things you'd like to share around those types of strategies?
I can talk about the challenges. Being someone who grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in a very urban space, the idea of making my own food or making stuff, although my mom did make her own clothes, and then she kind of fell off of that when she got too busy. And I remember wanting to learn this stuff, and not for many reasons, I didn't. And also my grandmother, she was someone who knew some about herbs. I remember as a kid that she would make these teas that tasted horrible to me. And she had an aloe plant, and she would use it for different things. I mean, all of this, which I now realize is like huge information. Like these are the resources like of how to use land to take care of yourself. And I mean, and also like to be able to create your own clothes, the creativity in that and everything. So, but one of the ways that I feel like I'm living into this design is the choice to live in certain environments. Like I've lived in Buddhist centers and communities with where we share resources. And that's been great and financially for me. And it's also been for me a way of enriching my personal life with other people who are seeking wisdom in these places. And it's like, I remember one day, like a couple of weeks after I moved to one Buddhist center, it had been snowing, and outside was someone who was, shoveling the snow. And I was like, this is so great that I don't have to shovel the snow. And it's just like how the community can work together where you do different things and you can share the work. And I lived in another community where, like me on my own, I don't have much farming, but we had a garden. And I remember how great it was to walk outside, and me, a Brooklyn kid, it felt so good to get collards and kale from the ground. And then, and then I'm like, how is this different? It felt so different than buying it, because you pull it out of the ground and then 10 minutes later, it's in this skillet with your eggs and everything. And so the next time I go to these plants, I'm like, I'm living because of you. and that felt very sweet. What I say is that these systems take time, but it gives you such a different quality of life.
Well said, Phoenix. I'm thinking about the beautiful multiple benefits of being in that ecosystem where, there are people, believe it or not, who actually enjoy the complementary things that we don't like to do. And so this mindset of not having to do it all ourselves, but to be able to design. All the examples you mentioned made me think of a framework we teach in the course, which is it's impossible to take on this life design without structure and support. And so we always emphasize that. And that's going to look so different for each one of us, the types of structures that each one of us, the types of ways we learn and ways we relate to new information and integrating new habits and behaviors that, people geek out on, proselytizing this particular formula for adopting new habits, but it's so particular to each person. And so creating for each one of us some element of structure, right? So that we have some form of accountability where we can come back to time and time again. What are our goals? How do we evaluate how we're tracking towards those? And then support. We cannot get trapped by the same old patterns of thinking we can be completely autonomous in our food needs or completely autonomous in our completely free of the monetary system. It's really, really, those are some big extremes. And so how do we really create systems of people, friends, families, coworkers that really support us in the endeavors to redesign our lives?
Yeah, to say that, I think you're a great model of this. Can you talk about the different groups that you're a part of, like the sheep herding group or the goat herding, some herding?
Yeah, well, so the first thing in COVID that I looked out for was when COVID happened, I was very curious about building more skills to meet my calorie needs, my food calorie needs locally, so that if there were supply chain fractures in the supply chain for food, that I would be able to find ways to feed my community, my neighbors, myself, my partner. And so I joined a goat collective, and I was so grateful to be able to do it as a collective, because milking goats every single morning, if you own your own dairy, many people know what I mean who might be listening to this, it is a lot of work. But I was able to join this existing collective of a small goat dairy herd, between 6 and 10 goats at a given time. And then I only had to milk once a week. And to this day, I've kept it up. So now it's 2 years later, I've been a part of this goat collective. And when we're in milking, which is not year round, I milk once a week, and I make cheese and yogurt. And, I have this kind of staple, and a lot of folks talk about how important grass-fed vitamin A dairy products are for human culture. There's so many generations, like the Maasai, and there's so many like lineages of this kind of keystone vitamin rich food source that we can be a part of. And for me, it's been a real joy to be intimately connected to that aspect of my calorie and food source needs.
Yeah, that's beautiful to hear. And I'm dairy free, but I remember getting a cup of goat milk that like 2 hours from when it was milked. And I was like, this is something else. This tasted very different. And so, but I imagine that some people listening might be like, well, I live in an urban center. There's no goats around here. But there's other systems if you look out for them. For example, one of the things that I did at one point, I was very into creating film, and I joined a public access station. And so they had video equipment, and I had to go through a training, and I got to use equipment that I would have been so expensive to buy on my own. And then I also get a community out of that. There was editing equipment that we had, there were classes, and then there was a whole community of people to support getting better at it. And I mean, sometimes people think, if I can afford it, then I should do that. Well, there's definitely there can be pluses to that, but there's also a lot of pluses to being in a community where, because you have these conversations, you get to learn about the newest thing, because you go to a class and then you chat with someone after, or you're editing and then you go out to take a walk and you end up in these little conversations. A lot of things can come up from that. Also, like things like community acupuncture, for example. Like sometimes acupuncture, for example, could be $80 for one visit, but then you have these community acupuncture centers that you end up being able to go for $20 to $40 a session. And they say that they think that those things might even be more helpful because there's something about healing and community that can be very good for the nervous system. And I remember loving the Berkeley acupuncture because there were more availability times. I mean, because I could go there and maybe in like sometimes a day before, or if I really lucked out that day, I could sign up for something. Whereas usually if you have a single acupuncturist in an office who has clients, it's 9 to 5. You better make sure you have an appointment a week ahead. So whenever you can get into these situations where you can pool resources together, and sometimes it's just about being creative and looking for them and asking around.
I love the way you are reframing this, Phoenix. A lot of people come into the idea of redesigning their life with a lot of overwhelm. And the reframe I'm hearing you make, which others like Christine Platt, who wrote the Afro Minimalist Guide to Living with Less, and many others, there's a book called The Art of Frugal Hedonism. The reframe is, how does the design become joyful and liberatory and increase our quality of life, so that it's not compromise, sacrifice. I have one more thing to add to my to-do list. But I mean, for me, like being in relationship to the goats has been hugely joyful. And they are urban goats. And it did give me a chance to meet the West. In West Oakland, there's a whole herd of urban West Oakland goats. So it can be done in a city.
Thank you for that correction.
What else? I mean, it comes to mind that there's another piece of this, which is life design, this reclamation of agency over where the implications of our money and spending habits, and even we have a whole like framework around divestment, investment, barter, gift economy. Well, here's an example that comes up a lot for when we look at, oftentimes there are certain line items in our personal budgets that are more consequential than others. And one of those is housing. And you have really innovated in housing from what you shared around being able to actually live in Buddhist centers and meet your housing needs through actually providing a service to those communities. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think I'm lucky that this is a part of the Buddhist tradition I'm in, and that these were somewhat big systems. I mean, but then, there's a whole system from Asia where Buddhism started of monasteries, of monks. And the thing is that the line, it's not as difficult for lay people to become a part of that system. It's not as, where Christianity, you might have to take oath. You can take an oath and be a monk for a couple of weeks and then, or, maybe not a couple of weeks, but, for a while and then take it off, and it's not a big deal. So I think there's that, but I mean, these are religious organizations, but there's also secular staff. So you also don't have to live in that. But I remember it was actually some of it is because, I practice this, and this is, while I practice Buddhism, sometimes I'm not sure if I consider myself a Buddhist, but I practice it. So it was definitely part of, my life. But also I was in a situation where the owner of my building, they were going to sell it. So I was like, this might be a great time for an adventure right now. And and then, so you live there. And then one of the things I loved that was we had this shared bank where what happened is that you could choose to put something of your money into this shared resource. And then if there was emergencies that came up for the staff, you could make an application to use the money from this. So, like, for example, it's like everyone paid into it. And let's say one day someone's car broke down and they were like, hey, I need this amount of money. And then people would offer it as, would come together and say, yeah, that makes sense. We have enough money and they've been paying into the system for a while. And so and that was nice to have that bit of security, yeah.
And it's so fascinating you bring that example up, Phoenix, because one of the themes of the learning journey that people get really excited by is, how do we make decisions about collective use of resources, and how do we what are the nuts and bolts of collectivizing resources and having shared pools where we allocate different allocations, but not have it be one decision maker. And it's really apparent to me that most of us have not had any other or very, very little exposure to making decisions collectively in our lives.
Yes.
So we need practice.
We need practice. And it takes some patience, and it takes skill, and it can be done.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's a critical skill for life design because, I have been very privileged to have the opportunity to actually barter for housing on multiple occasions through my career. And that ability to shave off what for me, and this was in Sonoma County, which would have been, $1,500 a month easily for rent payments in a very inflated housing rental market, that enabled me to be able to work for very values aligned consulting projects and not have to command an excessive salary, because I literally saved, over $10,000 a year by bartering for my housing instead of, and, not everybody can do that. And not every context is a healthy context for bartering, because there are, toxic exploitative relationships where landlords will, try and barter for housing. And then because of the power dynamics, it's very stressful for that person who's on the receiving side of the housing. I'm not trying to say this as a prescription, because it's really, we have to be attending to the particular context and the human relationships that are going to make that a nourishing or a exploitative scenario. But rather than saying, oh, that's an impossible thing, if there were more cultural examples of that and it was more normalized. And then, of course, there's, changing the institutional systems that, might be blocking or in barriers to doing that more readily. But
right. I have a first draft of a novel because of some of the choices of living in a place. Yeah, not having to pay rent meant that I could take a job that had more spaciousness, and then I could have more time. To me, time is the most valuable thing ever. So if you think about many jobs, like I have a cousin who was going back into the workforce, and she said, I want a half-time job, which means 40 hours a week where I actually leave at 5. Like, I don't want a real job. I want, because it gets, she feels like a career job almost requires you to probably be staying late and having to be available after you leave work, or staying late. And that's a lot of people's experience. So being able to lower your overhead is a big part of being able to have more freedom of your time.
Phoenix, that example makes me think of a question. Could you talk a little bit about strategies in your life or examples you've seen other people use around the cultural baggage that comes from external judgment? I'm thinking about that example around, choosing to work less, and how much cultural baggage that might have, for many of us growing up in a culture that really valorizes working more and harder and, commanding huge salaries.
Yeah, it is true. And some of it is based on some real fears. Like, I had a family member sit me down and say, you should get a state job so you can get a pension. And these are traditional ways of having security and safety. And people wonder, how are you dealing with your retirement? And these are very good questions. And the thing is that a lot of people have jobs, and very few people have money saved for environment. I mean, I feel like looking up the statistics, I remember like that most people don't, even though they have these jobs that require so much time. And I mean, I think pivotal to a lot of my life decisions was when my mom had me late. So in a very young age, she was at a place where she couldn't work and she had health issues. And I felt I could see the way she had lived her life, putting herself last, had a lot to do with where she was and how it had in fact impacted her physically and mentally. So even though she had all these savings, she had no health to enjoy them. And that was really painful for me, because I remember this is the time where she had the most time, and she did have a pension. She had economically, she actually had a lot of the resources this society tells you to build up. But because she hadn't taken care of herself, and it was hard, and and that was really inspiring to me. And she had been in her as a young person, an artist, and had left that for very good reasons. I mean, an immigrant in America, she was working very hard, but it made me realize how limited any material success is if you don't take your whole self with it. And so I look at that. I do care about how I'm going to save for retirement. I do care about what are the systems that's going to care for me. But it's like holistically, like a job where I am giving so much of my heart and then it's not feeding me, or if I'm working and I'm having to sacrifice my well-being, that's not the answer either. I agree. Some people can be like, it'll somehow work out. And I don't know that that's healthy. But also thinking that if you just live conservatively following the rules, you're going to be taken care of is also, I think, not unrealistic.
So well said. We have got to think move from an economy that compartmentalizes and exploits people to an economy that embraces the whole person. And really that's like core principle, our health, our well-being, our emotional well-being, and values that. And one of the tools we use in the MBA course is actually a tool called Resilient Retirement Calculator or Reimagining Retirement. And it's actually a tool that was birthed out of an initiative we launched called the Next Egg, which is an initiative to help communities, individuals move what is equivalent of $35 trillion in U.S. retirement savings. That's how much assets are in retirement savings right now in the U.S. In fact, the more people have retirement savings than they have a savings account in the US right now. And that, unfortunately, most of that is contributing to the deterioration of our environment, of communities, of speculative real estate. And the tragedy of that is we absolutely can create a different form of saving, quote unquote, saving for retirement. And so it is a really poignant thing you bring up around, we should be thinking about saving for retirement. It is prudent. And the systems we've inherited allow us to save for retirement at the cost of holistic community level health. So figuring out ways and innovating and doing it in community to figure out pathways out of that is something we talk about a lot at Lift Economy.
Yeah, I mean, it's like getting very real with yourself too about, your communities and how sustainable they are and what you're going to need. I'm curious what other alternative long-term health, that you're aware of that you could share with us.
What other long-term strategies?
Yeah,
it's so hard to, there are a few, maybe it would be helpful to share some of the kind of people that we are inspired by, the sort of kind of case stories, if you will, of people who are really doing incredibly inspiring life designs for their own personal lives. A few people that come to mind are Leah Penniman of Soulfire Farm in Grafton, New York. And I guess the reason I bring her up is, she began farming at the age of 16, really quickly noticed that the communities she was living in didn't have access to high quality, nutritious food. And even if they did, they wouldn't have been able to afford to buy it. So she created this farm, Soulfire Farm, and it has become real example of farming done differently across the U.S. People are looking at Soulfire Farm, farming in Afro-American traditions, using nitrogen-fixing legumes. They have a CSA, mutual aid networks, gifting food, bartering. It's an education and community building institution. She's written a book. And we had one of the members of that farm on our podcast as well, Cheryl Wilby. And it's just this ability to take what she saw as something quite systemic in terms of the design of access and food and resources, a very systemic, complex thing. And Leah and a huge community around her, it wasn't Leah alone, created a place-based institution where she could meet her needs, the community could meet their needs in ways that actually regenerated the ecosystem that they were stewarding, and creates all this other education and culture shift and all these benefits. And just what a beautiful example of designing livelihoods that have this ripple effect.
That makes sense to me, because I've seen that when you have less overhead, because I see it myself. I mean, these last few years that I've been living where I've mostly not paid rent, I have had more time. And so I've been able to create, do some projects that I wouldn't have had the time to do otherwise. I've been putting a lot of money into savings. Like a lot of times people think the way to make money is to make is to get a job that pays you a lot. But actually, you might get a job that pays you just decent, but because you're saving most of it, instead of having a lifestyle where you're spending most of it, especially since these places I was getting food. So there's, and it also makes sense because, you can look at, the time. When you have more time, then you start to be able to be creative, because we're living in emergency mode. Like, can you imagine if you have 20, 30, 40 years where you've only had 2 weeks of vacation every year, what that life looks like? Versus a life where maybe you're working 20 hours a week and then having sometimes where you have a couple of months off, 3 months off. In Europe, they have sometimes they have jobs where they have 2 months off a year. So, what kind of life would you create for yourself if you had that kind of time to just chill, to get away? And what kind of relationships could you build with your family, with your friends? What kinds of organizations or situations, the time you would get to explore, like how to just explore and figure and find things that you might not know about. Because sometimes you go into these jobs and you're putting all that energy into this narrow community of people who sometimes you're really aligned with and sometimes you're very alienated from. So that's another way of thinking about it.
Absolutely. And I'm going to say something that I probably should have a statistic to back up, but I'm just going to say it. That, to me, when humans have time for creativity, it is the ultimate expression of really getting away from some of the traps that are causing the climate crisis right now. To me, it's like so much of our ecological crises are driven, and there's other people who've said it way better than I'm thinking of Leah Thomas, who wrote The Intersectional Environmentalists, and other people who are really raising awareness about how when we get back into balance in a more mindful way with how we're choosing to use our time, and when we free up more capacity for human creativity and joy and connection, we're actually able to meet a lot of these needs that the media would have us believe we have to spend money on fancy plane trips and vacations. And there's a notion of a staycation, which is where you actually stay at home and explore your home in new ways and visit places that so much of the time we just don't have time for because we're at the 9-to-5 grind. So I have a lot of faith that in the human potential to be able to rebalance our relationship with the environmental degradation that's happening so much around us, and also the human degradation associated, the exploitation of people that's associated with that constant spending and more and more. And so prayer for that. And I hope this podcast sparks some curiosity for folks to learn more and reach out to us with their own stories and ideas of how they've been experimenting, and where they're also reach out if you feel blocked, if you need support, if you need to be a part of a community that's, fumbling through this with you. We definitely need each other.
Erin, can you think of some places people could research online? You had mentioned the book. What's her name?
Christine Platt.
Christine Platt.
Yep, she has an online community for
Yeah.
sure. There's a directory called Black Minimalist Directory that I love because it has a lot of really amazing stories of folks identifying as African American or rooted in Black traditions. I think another place to look is just there's a global movement called that has a lot of iterations of it, but a good keyword search is permaculture. That often can kind of open up channels in your local community of people that are really looking holistically, because permaculture often is perceived as a gardening technique, but it's really a life design pathway. It's a way of really designing our economic choices, our building choices, our ecosystem, our physical space to basically leave the planet better than we found it. Those would be a couple resources.
And what's that group that does the next? Like in Berkeley, they would come together and they would share vegetables with each other. Maybe we'll put it in the show notes.
Ooh, yeah, we can put it in the show notes. There's also food is one of those places where there's a lot of resources around sharing and bartering and gifting food and gleaning. The gleaning movement is a good one.
And then there's food co-ops, and knowing about them is good. Food banks. Yeah.
Food Not Bombs. I mean, I find like volunteering for an event, you can volunteer for a cause you love, volunteer at an event, and oftentimes they have extra surplus food at that event you can take home. Yeah, there's so many resources. And in fact, Phoenix, I wasn't going to mention it, but we do have Lift Economy is scheming on a whole training all about this called Next Economy Living. So if folks are curious to learn more, email us because that might be launching in 2023.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, this has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, this is just the beginning of a big journey for all of us. I haven't found any experts on this regard yet. We're all beginners.
Yeah, we're all pioneers in this realm. Yeah. Thanks for all that you're doing.
Thank you for all that you're doing. Have a great rest of your evening.
You too.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.